Star Wars is one of the largest franchises of all time, with movies spanning across decades, and along with that we've seen the uptake in Star Wars games increase in popularity, from Jedi Survivor to Fallen Order. But we hadn't seen a true open world title until now, with the release of Star Wars Outlaws. So with any big new game release, we've been tirelessly testing how it performs on a bucket load of graphics cards, at 3 resolutions and 4 quality presets, as well as looking at full ray tracing and upscaling that's baked directly into the game. So sit back, as there's a lot to go through. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Okay, so I won't touch on the game itself too much because, and I know this will trigger some people, but I've never actually seen Star Wars. None of them. Shock horror, I know, but it is what it is. So let's move on. What can I say? As an outsider well, Ubisoft have had big successes with open world games like The Division. So even though I'm not into Star Wars, I'm expecting good things from Outlaws. Though I will warn you that to get any form of open world parts of the game and actually get involved with that side of it, it will take close to 2 hours, as I had to experience myself, before I could actually get to a suitable area to benchmark. I settled on, and I may even butcher the name, Miragana Valley as the place I'd use for my run. And this is the first place that you're actually able to go and kind of free roam for yourself, and is an area that's able to utilise GPUs to their fullest. But in all honesty, that can be said for most of the game. It is pretty GPU intensive. Now, before I jump into the quality presets and the data, I will admit that the game does have some issues, and that's pretty apparent just by checking Reddit and the like. Though the only issue I really had came down to changing resolution and settings, especially on lower end cards where the game would just simply crash. But beyond that, it wasn't too bad. Well, beyond the NPCs who like to mow you down while you're standing still, or just wait around for you to move, before then mowing you down. So, I don't know, a fun experience, should we say? Now, going back to the settings side of things, much like we're starting to see with a lot of games these days, ray tracing is actually baked into the preset, and there's essentially no way to turn it off completely. And to combat the hit that you take in performance, the game does have various upscalers to help push the frame rate back up, while, of course, increasing visual fidelity. In terms of the settings, it's broken up into 2 sections labelled as video and graphics. The video menu is where you can enable or disable VSync, change the display mode, resolution, frame rate limiters, and adjust the upscaler type, of which, to make things as fair as possible, we went with temporal anti-aliasing for our tests, with the upscaler mode set to off and the upscaler quality set to native AA. In the graphics menu, you have the 4 presets, which are low, medium, high, and ultra, and of course you have options to go into the advanced menu to dial things in a little further, along with adjusting film grain, motion blur, and changing the varying levels of RTX direct lighting, and even an MSI Mystic Light option for those who want an even more immersive experience, I guess. Now, as the game is made in conjunction with Nvidia, it's pretty clear that in terms of performance, Nvidia should hold a bias here, especially as ray tracing is enabled by default and technically can't be turned off either. And this is, like I say, a common trend with titles that we've seen lately, with the last game that we looked at being Black Myth Wukong. So I guess you can expect more games to feature this and give stronger performance to the green team overall. Now, before we actually get into the performance, let's take a look at the visual quality and, well, actually what's on offer. So starting things off, although we recorded and are displaying this in 4K, I can tell you from personal experience that 1080p at any preset looks pretty shocking. The colours in the darker portions of the image lack detail, and aliasing in finer objects such as hair is very pronounced. This results in a very soft and visually unpleasing image, making toggling the highest graphics preset, well, just a complete waste of time. Thankfully, upgrading to 1440p resulted in a vastly superior image quality, marking the most significant improvement between any 2 resolutions. The higher pixel density allows finer details such as foliage to be rendered accurately. Textures remain crisp in both shadows and highlights, fully taking advantage of the game's dynamic lighting. it just overall looks a million times better. Then at 4K, the Ultra preset reaches its full potential. Every detail in the shadowed rock face is preserved, colours appear at their most vibrant, with the underside of the rock formation rendered in a rich, kind of deep red. Objects that appeared as maybe simple solid colours at lower resolutions now benefit from subtle shading, adding depth and a lived-in feel to the world. This enhanced sharpness and colour accuracy make the game environment just incredibly immersive. Moving on to the presets, which we recorded all at 4K to see the biggest visual difference, and starting with the low preset, and here we see that things aren't particularly clear. Textures are flat, edges aren't smooth, and shadows are pretty low resolution. On top of that, we also see a weird halo effect around the character's hair that creates a very strange look, like a poorly done green screen. Comparing that to medium, we see some improvements, most noticeably with the player's hair and edges looking a lot better. Textures are still a little low and the resolution of the shadows is still also pretty undefined, but there is an added softness to it now that helps with the realism factor in terms of visual immersion. When we bump things up to higher, we can see more improvements, with edges, hair and textures all being the most noticeable increases. Following on from medium, the edges and hair both gain some sharpness and definition, making them clearer and just more accurate overall. Texture quality also sees a boost with this preset, with some more depth being added to it compared to the previous presets. Shadows are still similar to where they were before, so we still do have some room for improvement, but overall it's a lot better. That then leads me on to the Ultra preset, where we actually don't see much improvement at all, and find that even though we see some small improvements in things like texture quality and the quality of lighting, we would probably be better off sticking to high for the slight performance increase that you see over Ultra. The game doesn't look bad by any means, but I think it's safe to say that we've seen other games like Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong harnessing the potential of newer GPUs and looking much more refined overall. And whilst those games do look a lot better, it does come at a sacrifice of performance. So in theory, we should see better performance here today, or at least we can hope. So let's get into the meat of it. The reason you're here is to see how your graphics card performs in-game. And I want to warn you straight off the bat that we have a lot of data to go through, which consisted of me getting around 6 hours sleep in a 72-hour period to get this out to coincide with the release of the game. For our testing, we used our GPU test system with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 DDR5 memory. For the motherboard, we used the Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with the latest BIOS version installed, along with Windows 11 on its latest official update. Driver-wise, we used AMD, Intel and Nvidia's latest drivers, and we tested 35 GPUs in total, including all cards from the latest generations from each brand, as well as some older cards to see how they'd hold up. And while we kept things native, we will be looking at upscaling performance a little later on too. So starting with the low preset at 1080p, and right away we see the 4080 Super is actually tied with the 4090 for first place, but does see an improvement in the 1% lows of around 3%. This will likely remain limited to this resolution and graphics setting, though as we are simply seeing CPU bottlenecks, and increasing the graphical preset or resolution will move the two cards around a little bit. In terms of other cards, we have the likes of the AMD 7900 XTX, which falls behind the 4070 Ti by around 2%, which is good news for the Nvidia card as it comes in cheaper at the moment and therefore offers better value in this scenario. The 7900 XTX also happens to fall behind the Nvidia flagship by 13%, which is disappointing but not unexpected considering the game has ray tracing baked in. Moving further down the list, we see performance dropping as you'd expect, with the 7900 GRE notably only coming in with only 2% more performance than the 6900 XT from last generation. Beyond that, we still have some pretty strong performance all the way down to the likes of the Arc A750, which just pushes past 60 FPS with some strong performance from both AMD and Nvidia across the board, with one exception being the RTX 3050, which even on low and at 1080p sees a somewhat paltry 51 FPS, and anything below 60, especially in more intensive areas, does feel, well, quite choppy. Moving up to 1440p, and straight away the RTX 4090 takes a pretty clear lead, now that the CPU is less kind of the equation and the GPU takes over. On the Nvidia side, we're still good on the 40 series all the way down to the lowest end RTX 4060 at 61 FPS, though AMD, as expected, takes a hit, with cards like the RX 7600 XT falling short of 60 frames per second. And now both Intel GPUs do start to, well, suffer somewhat. Though one standout card for me is the 2080 Ti, which still packs a punch at 71 FPS, which puts it between the RTX 3060 Ti and RTX 3070, which are still good at 1440p on the low preset, though I fear they may take a hammering as we move up in resolution and quality settings. At 4K, the RTX 4090 is still flying, coming in at 113 FPS, and now the 7900 XTX is starting to show some cracks, as it comes in at 77 frames per second, which is only just above the RTX 4070 Ti Super. Ideally, on the Nvidia side, you're going to want an RTX 4070 Super or higher from the current generation, and you could probably scrape by with an RTX 3080 12GB, though, again, more intensive parts of the games could knock the performance down, and upscaling may be the saviour here. For AMD, the 7900 Gree now drops below 60 FPS, and the RX 6950 XT just about hangs on, hovering at 60 frames per second. Though again, upscaling would help this, along with any of the cards that drop down, and, well, at 4K you're unlikely to notice huge differences in the visuals anyway. Moving back down to 1080p, but this time on the medium quality preset, and again, the 4090 and 4080 Super draw ever closer, though there is some separation, but still showing that CPU bottleneck on these super powerful cards is still prevalent. AMD's top tier 7900 XTX sits a fair bit lower and is still being beaten by the 4070 Ti series GPUs, albeit only by a small margin. We're still well above 100 frames per second on the RTX 4070, 7800 XT, 6800 XT and above, and some of the RTX 30 series cards as well, so that's very much welcomed. And again, the likes of the 2080 Ti and even the 2080 Super still managed to hold their own in this situation. Now, ideally, I'd be advising against upscaling at 1080p, as 1080p does look, well, pretty butchered anyway, and utilising upscaling would see it running at 720p, for instance, which, well, really wouldn't do you any favours in terms of the visuals. 1440p knocks performance down across the board, as you'd expect, but there's still a handful of cards sitting at plus 100 FPS, ranging from the 4070 Ti at 116 frames per second, though its little brother, the RTX 4070 Super, only just misses the mark by a margin of error 1 frame per second. AMD again takes the bigger beating, with only the 7900 XTX and 7900 XT surpassing 100 frames per second, though everything from the 7700 XT and up is still good for 60 FPS. The RTX 30 series still fares pretty well, as do some of the higher end but older 6000 Radeon series GPUs, while anything on the 30 series below a 3060 Ti can only be saved by upscaling, though I'd want to keep it at least pretty modest, or at least dial back some of the graphical settings a little to strike a nice balance. In terms of Intel, they are now essentially out of the game, without doing some tweaks at least, because while it's still playable, it will feel quite choppy. At 4K, we now only have one card sitting above 100 FPS, and that's the RTX 4090. AMD's 7900 XTX manages to fare better than the 4070 Ti Super here, but only by a margin of error difference. But the ray tracing performance on Nvidia really does offer up, I guess, better value for money. And if you want some more performance, you can always enable frame generation, though AMD of course has the same with FSR3. Keeping above 60 is the 7900 XT, RTX 3090 and 3090 Ti, but the Radeon 6000 series is now starting to show its age, along with the RTX 20 series that just struggled to even hit 40 frames per second. Moving up one more preset to the high quality setting, but dropping the resolution to 1080p, and we're still showing some strong performance across the board. The RTX 4090 has widened its gap now over all other cards, and the complete 40 series will end up with, I guess, what you'd class as an enjoyable gaming experience. Sadly, the same can't be said for the RX 7000 series, where the RX 7600 8GB slips 5 FPS behind that 60 FPS threshold that most gamers crave. There is still some strength within the 30 series, which just further shows the Nvidia bias in this title, as anything from the 3060 Ti is good for 68 FPS or higher, though the RTX 3060 only just drops below 60 FPS, and retesting could see that increase, though could see the opposite too. The 2080 Ti and 2080 Super are still holding strong too, above 60 FPS, though along with the RTX 3060, we now see both Intel Arc cards struggling a fair bit. Again, upscaling could help, but at 1080p, expect it to look pretty shocking in terms of the visuals, so really, that comes down to a personal preference. At 1440p, there's still a good balance for what we see here. The RTX 4090 is now in a league of its own, followed by the rest of the 40 series, with the 7900 XTX now sitting matched in terms of performance to the RTX 4070 Ti Super, though with a margin of error better result in the lows. There is still more than half the GPUs tested given 60 FPS or higher, which is nice to see, with some worthy and notable mentions coming from the 7700 XT, RTX 3070 Ti and 6800 XT, along with the 2080 Ti, which seems to be a card that, well, just won't give up, as it's within a margin of error 2 FPS from being what I'd class as completely playable. At 4K, we now see the RTX 4090 dropping below 100 FPS, though it still holds a healthy lead over everything else. The 7900 XTX now comes in with stronger performance than the 4070 Ti Super, which now falls below 60 FPS, albeit by a single frame per second. While only one card from the 30 series manages to get a pass at 60 FPS, with all RX 6000 series and the rest of the 30 series stack starting to struggle. Frame gen, FSR, upscaling, whatever you do, it's probably a wise choice to tinker if you're on older hardware, as the high preset does give a lot more dynamic range in contrast to the image. So for me personally, I'd rather try and hit that with my hardware than have to suffer by dropping down settings or resolution. So the big one, Ultra, and at 1080p, I'm actually quite surprised and impressed by the amount of cards managing to hit not just 60 FPS, but over, and in some cases well in excess of 100 frames per second. Some cards worthy of a mention, of course, beyond the RTX 4060 Ti or above, are the 7700 XT and above, RX 6800 and above, and RTX 3070 and above, which all hit and surpass 60 frames per second, including the trusty favourite 2080 Ti, which is still good for 63 FPS, and essentially, well, refuses to die. Now Intel, well, they're now at unplayable levels without any form of upscaling, so that's worth keeping in mind, though again, we are at 1080p and upscaling will frankly look trash anyway. At 1440p, the RTX 4090 is now the only card pushing beyond 60 FPS, though an honourable mention to the 4080 Super and non-Super, which only just fall short and still show impressive performance, along with the 7900 XTX, which has drawn closer to the 4080 series. In terms of the rest of the 40 series, anything from the RTX 4070 and up is good for 60, while on AMD you're going to have to utilise the 7900 GRE or above if you want that magic number without any form of upscaling. The 6950 XT is still holding its own too, along with the 3080 series and above from yesteryear, while now our trusty 2080 Ti drops to just 52 frames per second. But at 1440p, upscaling could help push things in the right direction without suffering in the visuals too much and getting that last bit of life from the Turing-based GPU. Then lastly, at 4K, the RTX 4090 is good for 75 frames per second, while every other card on the chart falls short of 60. Though the 4080 and 4080 Super are only just behind, and a little bump using upscaling would see them increase quite dramatically. The same can be said about most other cards, including the 7900 XTX, and even to a degree the 7900 XT, along with the 4070 Ti Super and non-Super cards, and maybe even the 3090 Ti while I'm looking at it. But beyond that, we're just looking at most GPUs sitting in the 30 FPS range. And while upscaling could help, I'd rather just look at the difference between utilising that or dialing down the settings and seeing what feels and looks more natural to you. Well, some cards like the Intel Arc cards and lower end RX 7000 series and 30 series cards, well, they're in the teens in terms of frame rate and, well, even with upscaling, are likely beyond saving. So some pretty strong performance and some results that were actually quite surprising, especially on the newer and lower end or older but still somewhat higher end. What is clear to see is that due to the baked-in ray tracing that this title has, Nvidia did exceptionally better across the board. Now, speaking of ray tracing, much like we did with Black Myth Wukong, I wanted to take it a step further to see what difference that, along with upscaling, makes on the two top flagship cards from both AMD and Nvidia. This is great to compare each card to each other and how it handles the technologies differently, but also how it handles the comparison against the card's own native performance, because that way you can see if upscaling is really going to make a difference in terms of performance and also if ray tracing is really going to have a hit. What we saw was that on the 7900 XTX, when we enabled FSR, there was a drop in performance of around 10%, down from 51 FPS to just 46. So if you want to run natively, I'd advise avoiding that, especially as the 1% low dropped quite dramatically. Luckily, FSR set to balance did see a healthy uplift, taking it up to 84 FPS, which is a 65% increase in performance and better than what frame generation gave us on its own. Combining the two gave us our best result of 138 frames per second, which equates to a pretty staggering 170% increase in performance. But as we know, frame rate isn't everything, because we wanted to also see what it meant for performance in terms of ray tracing when it's set to ultra. It's here where enabling ray tracing tanked the performance pretty hard on AMD to just 14 frames per second. And again, the combination of FSR set to balanced and frame generation turned on fell just shy of 60 FPS, coming in at 59 frames per second, which is a nice uplift, but not great for AMD's flagship model. Luckily, Nvidia's RTX 4090 fared a lot better with a 1 FPS difference between native TAA and DLSS at native, with a 48% increase in performance when enabling frame gen, and then a further 10% increase with DLSS set to balanced and turning frame generation off. Again, the combination of the two is the strongest at 159 frames per second, which is a 112% improvement over the native TAA result. Again, looking at ray tracing, and we do take a hit of 60%, dropping us down to 30 FPS, but that's still a lot better than what we saw in terms of raw numbers from AMD. And setting DLSS to balance does push things back up over 60 FPS. Though again, the winning combo is DLSS set to balanced and frame generation enabled, which resulted in 98 frames per second, which is a 31% uplift in performance over native, and with considerably better visuals, as we're essentially maxed out now. So one of the hottest games of the year, tested and done. Now, performance was actually, like I mentioned, pretty surprising, especially on older cards that were still able to keep up where it mattered. 2080 Ti, I'm looking at you. Now, I think it's pretty clear that, well, 1080p isn't great, no matter whether you're on low or whether you're on ultra. The bump up to 1440p just has so much more visual clarity. And when you look at the likes of 1080p on medium compared to, say, 1440p on low, you will lose some detail, but the clarity in terms of pixel density more than makes up for it, without sacrificing or suffering too much in terms of the actual performance. So honestly, that's where I'd be pushing you to play at. Performance on high, which is, I guess, arguably where most people will want to be playing, and at 1440p, was still strong. Just looking at older cards like the 2080 Ti at 58 frames per second wasn't too far off the mark. And then you've got the likes of the 7700 XT at 62 frames per second. So even mid-range newer cards and older GPUs do perform well in this game. In all honesty, when it comes to increasing beyond 1440p to 4K, or from low to medium to high and then on to ultra, it really is going to come down to what GPU you have, and then personal preference and what looks, and more importantly, feels good for you. I mean, I mentioned throughout that anything below 60 feels just a bit choppy, but there were moments for cards above that where the movement just feels a little bit off. And this should actually be fixable through game and driver updates to just feel a bit more fluid and smooth. But for now, it's still early days, and lots of users have already complained about bugs. But being a Ubisoft title, yeah, it's not surprising in the least. Just like we saw with Black Myth Wukong, these new games are actually able to push things, and having ray tracing as standard is definitely going to favour Nvidia over the competition, and is definitely going to maybe somewhat suffer on older cards. And then obviously with that, and Nvidia having that kind of upper hand, performance will be at a lower level than what some consumers may expect. But thanks to upscaling, and then even on the AMD side, FSR, Nvidia, frame generation, and so on, there are actually ways of getting performance back up to levels that I guess the average consumer expects from their expensive GPU. But my major warning would be, don't do it at 1080p, as it already looks very, very bad. And decreasing the render resolution is just going to make things even worse in terms of the visuals, even if it is at a sacrifice for more performance. Now, it will be interesting to see how the reviews are a week after launch, but from the 2 hours of actual gameplay that I did to get to our benchmark point, and the fact that I've never even seen Star Wars, I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a mixture of, I guess, The Division coupled with Metal Gear Solid. And though I may get flamed for them comments, that's my perception, having never played anything Star Wars related, or watching anything Star Wars related. Others have also commented that it's like Red Dead Redemption, but in space. And I can kind of see that too. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if I can enjoy it with no allegiance, see what I did there, to the franchise, if you're a fan, I think it's safe to say that you'll like it even more. So yeah, there we go. That's about going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the huge monumental amount of testing that we did for this one, then you can help support everything we do over on Patreon. You'll get access to a lot of our testing data, the ability to join a super special area over on our Discord, exclusive behind the scenes content, and so much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.